Pronto and welcome to the Future of Food series, and this is episode number 5, and I'm delighted to have with me today Cameron Scadding, the CEO of SourceCertain in Perth, Australia. Cameron, how are you?
I'm very well, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us from Thailand this morning. And hey, Cameron, I'm going to challenge you straight away. Give me the 1-minute pitch on you and your company.
Fantastic. I always love the elevator pitch. Yeah, so at SourceCertain, John, we have a belief in trusted supply chains, and ultimately what we do is we deploy a forensic level provenance capability to underpin the integrity of a supply chain. The technology itself is strongly tested and robustly tested and has been used all over the world in a legal setting mostly. And ultimately what we've done is we've built a whole range of supply chain services which use the technology to test the integrity of the supply chain. As for me personally, I'm a forensic chemist by training, but I founded my first business in 2006, which was an analytical service business. SourceCertain came from there and is only 2 to 3 years old now, but is ultimately a commercialisation of some of the technology that we developed. Son of a wheat and sheep farmer, so deeply passionate about agri-food and believe really strongly in the fact that we can fix some of these problems.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cameron. So from your perspective or your vantage point as an analytical laboratory, you have a different perspective on the food industry. So what do you see as the key challenges that the food industry are facing today? And how is your company addressing those?
Gee, it's a huge question, isn't it? And I think about it more than I'd like probably, because it can be a little intimidating. And I do spend a fair bit of time in aeroplanes, and I think it's some of the big picture stuff that I think we have to have our eyes on. I think you can always distill them down to food security. I think it's always about enough safe food. But I think inside that or around that is some of the really big challenges around climate change, which we still tend to be having an almost childish debate around whether it's real or not, instead of moving to maybe fixing some of these problems. I think the whole antimicrobial resistance issue is also substantial. You know, I think there's even a potential that, you know, one of our single biggest advances in medical science could also be one of our biggest threats. And we don't tend to be moving to fix any of these things. But, you know, inside the bit that I'm focused on and the bit that SourceCertain's focused on, I think we sit inside the food security bit. Ultimately, we're around enough safe food. I think the big challenges inside those are there's definitely, you know, a shift towards there being a need for more transparency inside the food chain. Whether that just be about making sure that people are behaving properly, or whether it be about consumers trusting kind of the stakeholders in the chain, there's definitely a shift towards it. The bit that we do, and I kind of believe, and I think we're aligned in this view, that there's an ecosystem, you know, of people that hold up the food system, that make it safe, or help make it safe. The small piece, although quite technologically advanced piece, I would argue, is that we believe that consumers have a right to know where their food has come from, and they have a right to know how it's been produced, and they certainly should be getting what they pay for. And ultimately, the piece that we do is we deploy some of our technology, which is a forensic-based verification of provenance, to make sure the food has come from where it's claimed to have come from. I argue that ultimately knowing where the food comes from, and although we're agnostic to supply chain, we're focused on food here, knowing where it comes from is fundamental to the rest of the systems that get employed inside the food ecosystem to make sure we have enough safe food.
Gotcha. Now that's very important. You mentioned something I think is critically important to the food industry, and that's provenance. So can you explain what provenance is from a scientific perspective, and how the average person in the food industry who's not a chemist or a scientist, how they can understand provenance better?
Yeah, so we get asked this a lot. I mean, I think it's contextual too to the product. I hear a lot of argument around artwork as the example, you know, in terms of the provenance of an art piece, and it's not just about where it comes from; it's about the story and the associated things that have happened to it since it was actually painted. We would propose that it's actually simpler than that. Scientifically, the provenance piece is where has the item or object come from. Ultimately, it's around origin, but it could be a little more amorphous in terms of source. So, you know, for example, a hamburger patty, you know, has a lot of input sources. You know, lots of cows have gone into the production of said patty, but it'll have a discrete source whereby it's actually been made into that patty. And so we argue that the provenance piece is ultimately the origin by which that food has come from. And scientifically, it's around making sure that it's come from a specific, definable, granular location. So typically in the food chain, this is the farm of origin. And I often expand on this a little in the context of other definitions we see. So as a business, source certainty is all around provenance. We're about verifying where stuff comes from. We aren't a traceability business, for example. We can't say that when an item leaves the farm, how many other hands that it has actually gone through to get to its final end consumer. That is definitely in the realms of what we would define as traceability. And it's about, and I think that's probably the best lens to look at provenance by, is, which bit is the most important bit. Okay, it ultimately is around where has it come from. The traceability piece is how did it get from there to the end consumer. The traceability piece is critically important in a food safety context because some of that contamination might have happened along the way. The piece that we do, though, is underpin that key traceability information and say, yes, it's definitely come from that particular source, which means you can rely on that information.
So, and how do you do that, Cameron, if I can prod a little bit deeper on provenance?
Sure.
So what kind of scientific testing is necessary? Because we often hear that, software solutions can provide provenance, but I think they're talking more about data provenance versus the actual provenance of the animal and so on. Can you go just a little bit deeper? We don't have a lot of time, but can you go a little bit deeper on that?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of different methods, and we employ a lot of different analytical methods to determine where something comes from. So typically for us, the science that we developed and the science that we focus on, it's a chemical fingerprinting approach with a focus on elemental fingerprinting. So most of the periodic table to build a fingerprint, but it's also around isotope ratio. So the carbon 12, carbon 13 ratio. It can also be, the fatty acid profile. It can be a range of any different combinations of these methods, but it's absolute. It's inherent in the sample. You're absolutely right. We do hear a lot around data, around provenance and data solutions. Probably the key argument that we would make is that those are ultimately traceability providers or solutions, or chain of custody solutions, if you like. The piece that we do is we take the real food and we determine features that are inherent in the actual food sample and relate it back to where it's come from. So it's absolute in a sense, and it's robust to the point of being definable by origin. The data provenance piece, which I think is actually really important as well, is more about, okay, something that we affix to food and then track it through a data system.
Gotcha. Now, in about a minute or so, could you tell us about authenticity? We know that authenticity of a product is critical for the food industry. How do you approach that?
I think authenticity is everything. Actually, I think it's a catch-all. It definitely relates to the ultimate piece around integrity and delivering on a promise. In terms of testing, it's become a bit of a catch-all too. So authenticity testing can range from sort of species validation, for example, for fish. It can be provenance, which is certainly the area we focus, which can be, for example, has that piece of Canadian pork or alleged Canadian pork associated with that alleged Canadian certificate actually come from Canada. So our science, for example, one of our larger scale services that we've deployed is around verifying where meat like that has actually come from. You can determine with similar sorts of data whether it's been free range raised versus farm. It could also be the adulteration of sugars into honey, for example, or adulteration of sugars into fruit juice. Probably one of the more topical ones we're hearing a bit around now is the halal certification. Is it genuinely halal? And it's not just about certification. Can we develop a test that verifies that halal certification? So authenticity has become a bit of a catch-all, but I think it's all of those analytical sort of methods sort of caught into the one definition of authenticity.
Cameron, 20 seconds. You're up in front of 50 startup food companies. In 20 seconds, what guidance would you give them?
Yeah, so if you're in the food chain and actually looking to produce a product, I think it comes back to authenticity. I think you've got to keep it simple. You need to be authentic, and then you also absolutely have to be transparent. If you're on the technology side, which we are, I think it's about patience. I think agri-food is a bedrock of most cultures and most economies. It's slow moving, which means you need to be patient, and you also need to be very focused on your value proposition.
Wonderful. Listen, Cameron, thank you so much for taking 10 minutes out of your prized vacation to talk with us today.